Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we are peeling back the layers of millennia, venturing into the very dawn of human consciousness to explore the psychological and identity aspects of sex. Imagine, if you will, not the flickering neon of a city street, but the dancing, hungry flames of a primal fire, casting long, skittering shadows on damp cave walls. You hear the distant howl of something ancient and unknown, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, and feel the raw, instinctual thrum of survival, of connection, of a nascent you beginning to take shape against the vast, indifferent backdrop of prehistory. Tonight we delve into the very fabric of what makes us us, and let's be honest, understanding the primordial soup of our desires is a journey few psyches return from entirely unscathed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the edge of a world that is both terrifyingly new and deeply, uncomfortably familiar. The air is thick with a scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something animalistic, a current of unspoken communication that hums beneath the surface of every interaction. This is the stage for the primal dance, the very first clumsy, fumbling steps towards what will eventually become the complex tapestry of human sexual identity. There are no carefully curated dating profiles here, no witty text exchanges, no societal scripts beyond the most fundamental. Your Tinder profile, back then, was basically just how well you could chuck a spear and whether you generously shared your mammoth jerky. Attraction in this raw context is a potent, unfiltered force, but it's already beginning to shape who you are and who you are perceived to be by the small, tightly knit group that means the difference between survival and, well, becoming part of the fossil record a little sooner than planned. You watch as individuals within your clan display themselves. A male, perhaps, returns from a hunt, not just with sustenance, but with an air of competence, his movements economical, his gaze steady. He doesn't need to boast. His actions speak a language understood by all. This display of prowess, of resourcefulness, isn't just about providing food. It's an advertisement. It says, I am capable. I can protect. I can provide. And in the eyes of others, particularly potential mates, this capability starts to forge an identity, the provider, the strong one. His sense of self, his value within the group, becomes intrinsically linked to this perceived sexual and social currency. He's not just Oog, he's Oog, the guy who's surprisingly good at not getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers. It's a start. Then there's another, perhaps less physically imposing, who spends hours carefully chipping away at a piece of flint, not for a tool, but for something else. An adornment, a string of polished shells, a daub of ochre applied with surprising care. This act, seemingly frivolous in a world of constant peril, is another form of display. It whispers of patience, of an aesthetic sense, perhaps even of a mind capable of abstract thought beyond immediate needs. Is this an early stirring of art for attraction's sake? Does this careful self-decoration signal something about their inner world, a nascent identity as the one who sees beauty, or the one who creates? The Venus figurines, those enigmatic statuettes of voluptuous female forms found across prehistoric Europe, dating back as far as 30,000 years, certainly suggest a deep-seated human fascination with, and perhaps ritualization of, the body and its symbolic power in relation to fertility and survival. These weren't just idle carvings, they were potent symbols, their exact meaning still sparking debate, but undeniably linked to core aspects of existence, including procreation and, by extension, the identities wrapped up in those acts. You notice the interactions, the subtle shifts in posture, the lingering gazes, the tentative offerings, a choice piece of fruit, a smooth stone. Each one is a tiny thread in the weaving of relational identity. Who chooses whom? And on what basis? Is it purely instinct, a biological imperative driving you towards a genetically compatible other? Or are there already the faint outlines of social learning, of preference shaped by observing who is valued, who is successful, who seems to offer not just genetic material but also companionship or a shared understanding of this bewildering world? The concept of desirability itself begins to carve out identities. If you are consistently chosen or sought after, does that inflate your sense of self, your confidence? And if you are not, does that create a different kind underscore of self-perception, perhaps one of searching, of striving, or even of quiet resignation? Consider the very earliest hints of what we might later, much later, call gender roles. The division of labor, often speculated to have assigned hunting primarily to males due to upper body strength and child-rearing primarily to females due to biological necessity, would have inevitably shaped early identities. Your tasks, your daily contributions to the clan's survival, became a fundamental part of who you were. She who gathers roots and he who tracks the deer aren't just job descriptions. They are foundational identities, reinforced daily, and likely influencing how each perceive their role in mating and kinship structures. It's a far cry from modern complexities, but the seeds are there. And if you thought your family was judgmental about your partners, imagine having the entire clan silently observing your every courtship move from behind a particularly judgmental-looking rock. The pressure must have been immense, subtly shaping behavior towards what was deemed acceptable or advantageous. Historians still argue whether early human societies were predominantly matriarchal or patriarchal, or if such terms, laden with later cultural baggage, even apply to these fluid, small-scale groups. But whatever the dominant structure, it would have influenced the power dynamics in mating, the perceived value of individuals, and thus, their developing sense of self in relation to others. The very act of pair bonding, or its absence, would have been a significant factor. Did early humans form long-lasting bonds, or were arrangements more transient? Evidence is scarce, and interpretations vary wildly. Some anthropologists point to the prolonged dependency of human infants as a driver for more stable pairings, fostering an identity tied to partnership and co-parenting. Others suggest a more promiscuous structure, where identity was perhaps more individualistic or tied to broader kinship lines rather than a nuclear family unit. And let's not forget the quirky, the fringe. There's a rather delightful, if entirely speculative, theory that some early cave paintings, particularly those depicting hand stencils, might have been a form of individual marking or even a lonely heart's ad. Imagine, Cave 3B likes long walks on the tundra, good with a hand axe, seeking similar. See handprint for details. Probably not, but it's fun to imagine the very human urge to connect and define oneself reaching across the millennia. Early attempts at poetry were probably just. Section 2. You feel the chill of the night deepen, the fire now a bed of glowing embers, and as you drift through time, the raw, untamed landscape of primal existence begins to give way to something new, something more organized. You see the first tentative settlements, mud brick walls rising unsteadily, the faint glint of copper tools, and hear the murmur of early languages, more complex now, weaving stories, laws, and something else, the sacred. This is where the primal dance of attraction starts to be choreographed by a powerful new partner, religion. As societies grew beyond small hunter-gatherer bands, developing agriculture and more permanent communities around 10,000 BCE with the Neolithic Revolution, they also developed more elaborate systems of belief to explain the world and, critically, to regulate behavior, including the potent force of human sexuality. The identity of provider, or gatherer, starts to get overlaid with new, more spiritually charged labels. You find yourself in a world where the forces of nature, the sun, the moon, the rain, the very fertility of the earth, are not just phenomena, but deities, powerful entities to be appeased, worshipped, and emulated. And what is more fundamental to fertility, to the continuation of life, than the act of sex itself? Suddenly, this deeply personal, instinctual drive is no longer just about Oog and Ula making little Oogs and Ulas. It's about participating in a cosmic drama, a sacred duty. Your sexual identity becomes intertwined with your spiritual identity. In many early agricultural societies, sex was explicitly linked to the bounty of the land. Rituals emerged, sometimes involving symbolic or even actual sexual acts, designed to ensure good harvests and the prosperity of the community. Imagine the pressure. Your performance in the sacred grove tonight might just determine whether everyone starves next winter. No pressure, right? Talk about performance anxiety with cosmic stakes. You witness the rise of fertility goddesses, figures like Inanna in Mesopotamia or Isis in Egypt, powerful deities who embodied not just motherhood and creation, but also potent sexual agency. Their worshippers, particularly women, might find their own identities elevated, their roles as life-givers imbued with divine significance. Priestesses in some of these cults held considerable power and status, their sexuality seen not as a private matter, but as a conduit to the divine. The famous standard of Uar, a Sumerian artifact from around 2600 BCE, depicts scenes of banquets and processions, hinting at complex social and religious ceremonies where roles, and by extension identities, were clearly delineated and perhaps divinely sanctioned. Your ability to conceive, or to facilitate conception through ritual, could define your entire place in this new world order. You weren't just a woman. You were a vessel of the sacred, a reflection of the goddess herself. But just as religion could elevate and sacralize sex, it also began to draw lines, to create boundaries, to define what was acceptable and what was not. The concept of the taboo emerges, a powerful psychological force shaping behavior and identity. Certain sexual acts, certain pairings, certain times or places become forbidden, imbued with a sense of danger, of pollution, of offending the gods. This is a crucial development. For the first time, perhaps, your sexual desires aren't just yours. They are subject to a higher, unseen authority. Your identity starts to be shaped not just by what you do, but by what you don't do, by the internal struggle between desire and prohibition. The idea of purity, sexual, ritual, and moral, begins to take root. If you transgress, you are not just an outcast from the tribe, you are an offense to the divine order, a stain on the sacred fabric. That's a heavy weight for any burgeoning identity to bear. You can almost hear the internal monologue. The gods want me to be fruitful, but not with Gronder from the next village, because he worships the wrong kind of rock. This is complicated. Consider the Code of Hammurabi, dating back to around 1754 BCE in Babylon. While primarily a legal document, it contains numerous laws pertaining to marriage, adultery, and incest, reflecting a society already grappling with the need to regulate sexual behavior for social stability. These laws didn't just prescribe punishments, they reinforced societal norms and expectations, shaping how individuals understood their roles and responsibilities as husbands, wives, sons, and daughters. Your legal identity, as defined by your sexual relationships and conduct, became a powerful determinant of your social standing. If you were a married woman accused of adultery, your fate was grim, reflecting a patriarchal structure where female sexual fidelity was paramount for ensuring lineage and inheritance. Your very survival could depend on maintaining a sexually blameless identity. Historians still argue whether the primary function of these early religious and legal codes regarding sex was truly spiritual or more pragmatically aimed at social control, ensuring orderly inheritance, minimizing conflict within the group, or consolidating power for priestly or ruling class. Perhaps it was an inseparable blend of both. But the psychological impact was undeniable. Guilt, shame, and fear, alongside reverence and a sense of sacred duty, became deeply woven into the human experience of sexuality. Your inner landscape, your very sense underscore of self, now had to navigate these complex, often contradictory, messages emanating from the divine realm. My desires are God-given, a sacred fire, but if I act on them in the wrong way, I'm doomed. It's enough to give anyone an identity crisis. And let's not forget the quirky, perhaps even slightly unsettling, side of sacred sex. There are accounts from various ancient cultures of temple prostitution, where individuals engaged in sexual acts within a religious context, ostensibly as a form of worship or to generate income for the temple. Herodotus, the Greek historian, described such practices in Babylon, though the accuracy and interpretation of his accounts are debated by modern scholars. Imagine the identity of someone whose sexual expression was not only sanctioned, but required by their religious role. How did they reconcile personal desire with sacred duty, or navigate the social perceptions that must have come with such a life? It's a far cry from the individualistic pursuit of romantic love we often idealize today. Their identity was likely a complex fusion of the sacred and the transactional, a concept that might make our modern sensibilities squirm a little. You can picture the job interview. So, tell me about your previous experience in divine communion? The emergence of dualistic belief systems, like Zoroastrianism in ancient Persia, founded sometime before the 6th century BCE, which posited a cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, also had profound implications. Sex, like all human activities, could be framed within this cosmic battle. Acts aligned with procreation and social order might be seen as contributing to the forces of good, while others, perhaps those deemed excessive, non-procreative, or outside sanctioned relationships, could be cast as temptations of the dark side. Your sexual choices and the desires that fueled them weren't just personal, they had cosmic significance. This adds another layer of psychological weight, another dimension to your sexual identity. Are you a soldier for the light or a pawn of darkness? Section 3. You leave behind the incense-hazy temples and the rigid pronouncements of divine law, finding yourself blinking in the bright, clear sunlight of ancient Greece. The air here feels different, less heavy with the weight of unseen gods, and more alive with the buzz of human intellect, the sharp cadence of debate, and the resonant tones of lyres. Here, amidst the olive groves and the marble agoras, around the 6th to 4th centuries BCE, a new force begins to shape the understanding of sex and identity, philosophy. While the gods of Olympus, Zeus with his notorious infidelities, Aphrodite with her irresistible allure, certainly embodied a robust and often chaotic sexuality, it was the thinkers, the lovers of wisdom, who began to dissect desire, to question its nature, and to explore its connection to the human soul and the quest for a good life. Your identity is no longer solely defined by divine decree or tribal custom. It's becoming a subject for rational inquiry, for self-examination. You find yourself sitting, metaphorically, of course, unless you've discovered a remarkably comfortable time-traveling toga, at the feet of Socrates, that famously pugnacious questioner. He's not necessarily laying down laws about who you should or shouldn't sleep with, but he's relentlessly pushing you to know thyself. And how can you truly know yourself without understanding the powerful currents of desire, of eros, that move within you? Socrates, as Plato portrays him in dialogues like the Symposium, sees eros not merely as a base physical appetite, but as a spiritual force, a longing for beauty and truth that can elevate the soul. Your sexual desires, in this framework, are not something to be simply suppressed or indulged mindlessly. They are a starting point, a ladder that can lead you from attraction to a beautiful body, to an appreciation of beautiful minds, beautiful institutions, and ultimately, to the contemplation of beauty itself. Your identity, then, can be that of a philosophical lover, someone whose passions are guided by reason towards higher ideals. It's a rather more ambitious dating goal than doesn't grunt too much. Plato, Socrates' most famous student, takes these ideas and runs with them, or rather, writes extensively and beautifully about them. In the Symposium, he presents a variety of speeches on the nature of love and desire, each offering a different facet. Aristophanes tells a myth of original humans who were round, with 2 faces, for arms and 4 legs, later split in 2 by Zeus, forever condemned to search for their other half. This iconic story, while perhaps not meant literally, profoundly shapes a certain kind of romantic identity, the seeker of completion, the one whose sense of self feels incomplete without a soulmate. It's a powerful narrative that resonates even today, this idea that true identity is found in union with another. Then there's Diotimus' speech, relayed by Socrates, which describes that ladder of love, emphasizing the ascent from physical attraction to the pursuit of wisdom and immortality through intellectual procreation, leaving behind noble ideas and virtuous disciples. Your sexual energy, your creative force, can be channeled not just into making babies, but into making meaning. That's a significant expansion of sexual identity beyond mere biology. Aristotle, Plato's student, ever the pragmatist, brings a different lens. While he too values reason, his focus is more on the well-ordered life, on achieving eudaimonia or human flourishing within the context of the polis, the city-state. For Aristotle, sexual desire is a natural part of human life, but like all passions, it needs to be regulated by reason and habituated towards virtue. Your identity is that of a citizen, and your sexual conduct should align with the responsibilities and expectations of that role. Marriage, for Aristotle, is important for the household and the state, for the procreation of future citizens. Excessive or disordered desires are seen as detrimental to the individual's character and to social harmony. So, your sexual identity is less about mystical union or philosophical assent, and more about responsible self-management within a social framework. He's probably the kind of guy who'd have a very sensible, color-coded spreadsheet for his romantic life. Desire level, 3.7. Action, moderate contemplation, followed by a brisk walk. Then there's the rather distinctive aspect of Greek love, particularly pederasty, the socially acknowledged, though complex and debated, intimate relationships between older men and adolescent boys, especially within the aristocratic and military classes. This practice, exemplified in places like Athens and Sparta, though with different customs in each, was often framed not just as a sexual relationship, but as a pedagogical one, where the older Erast's lover was meant to mentor the younger Erimeno's beloved in virtue, citizenship, and manly excellence. The identity of both parties was intricately shaped by these relationships. For the youth, it was a rite of passage, a step towards adult male identity. For the older man, it was a mark of his status and his ability to inspire and educate. Historians still argue whether these relationships were primarily about love and mentorship, or if exploitation and power imbalance were inherent. Regardless, it represents a dramatically different construction of male sexual identity and bonding than what would become dominant in later Western cultures. The famous Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit comprised of 150 male couples, believed to fight more fiercely to protect their partners, stands as a powerful historical testament to the potent fusion of love, loyalty, and martial identity within this cultural context. You also see the prominent role of courtesans or hetaira in Greek society. Women like Aspasia of Miletus, the companion of the statesman Pericles, were often highly educated, witty, and independent, commanding a degree of social and intellectual freedom denied to most citizen wives, who were largely confined to the domestic sphere. The identity of the hetaira was a complex one, admired for her intellect and charm, sought after for companionship and sexual pleasure, yet existing outside the bounds of respectable marriage. She was, in a sense, a professional companion whose identity was built around her allure, her wit, and her ability to engage with men on an intellectual, as well as physical, level. It's a fascinating counterpoint to the more constrained identity of the Athenian wife, whose primary public identity was tied to her husband and her role in producing legitimate heirs. And let's not forget the quirky, sometimes bizarre, pronouncements of some philosophical schools. The Cynics, for instance, like Diogenes, advocated for a life lived in accordance with nature, rejecting social conventions as artificial and often hypocritical. Diogenes famously, and probably apocryphally, was said to have masturbated in public, arguing that if it was natural to satisfy hunger by eating, why not satisfy sexual urges just as openly? While extreme, and likely designed to shock, this reflects a philosophical stance that strips away societal layers to question the very basis of sexual shame and the identities built around it. His identity was that of the ultimate nonconformist, challenging every accepted norm, including those around sexual expression. Imagine Diogenes at a modern dinner party. Pass the salt?
Why?
Are you not yet sated with the artificial constructs of seasoning? Section 4. You feel the philosophical breezes of Greece fade, replaced by the clatter of legions, the stern pronouncements of law, and the sprawling, ambitious energy of Rome. As the Roman Republic and later the Empire, from roughly 27 BC to 476 CE in the West, extended its dominion, it also developed a complex legal and social framework that profoundly shaped how individuals understood their place in the world, and very much their sexual identities. While the Romans certainly appreciated pleasure, their banquets were legendary, their bathhouses notorious. Their approach to sex, at least in its public and legal dimensions, was often characterized by a focus on social order, civic duty, property, and power. Your desires are still very much present, but now they are navigated within a much more rigid, hierarchical structure, where your legal status and social role heavily dictate the boundaries of acceptable sexual expression. You find yourself in a society where the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, wielded immense authority, legally, over his wife, children, slaves, and even adult sons. His sexual identity was intrinsically linked to his power and his responsibility to produce legitimate heirs to continue the family line and inherit property. Marriage, for the Roman elite, was often less about romantic love, though that could certainly develop, and more about strategic alliances, the consolidation of wealth, and the production of citizens. A man's virtus, manliness, virtue, was demonstrated not just on the battlefield or in the Senate, but in his ability to govern his household, which included regulating the sexual conduct of its members. His identity was that of a master, a ruler in miniature, and his sexual prerogatives were extensive, at least with those deemed of lower status. He was expected to be dominant, to be the active partner. For a Roman woman of respectable standing, her sexual identity was overwhelmingly defined by her chastity, pudicitia, before marriage, and her fidelity within it. Her primary role was to be a wife and mother, producing legitimate children for her husband. The famous epitaph of Claudia, a Roman matron, praises her for loving her husband with all her heart, bearing 2 sons, and being charming in her speech and graceful in her bearing, but also for keeping the house and making wool. Her identity was woven from these domestic virtues and her reproductive capacity. Adultery on her part was a serious crime, severely punished, not just as a personal betrayal but as a threat to the patriarchal lineage and the stability of the family unit. In contrast, a husband's liaisons with slaves or prostitutes, while perhaps not always admired, were generally tolerated and not subject to the same legal or social condemnation, provided they didn't publicly shame his wife or neglect his familial duties. This stark double standard profoundly shaped the perceived sexual identities and acceptable behaviors for men and women. You see the complex institution of Roman slavery casting a long shadow over sexual identity. Slaves, legally considered property, had virtually no sexual autonomy. They could be, and often were, subjected to the sexual demands of their masters without legal recourse. The sexual identity of a slave was thus tragically erased or horrifically defined by their servitude. Conversely, the master's identity could be reinforced by this sexual access, a stark display of his power and ownership. Historians still argue about the extent to which genuine affection or even consensual relationships could exist within such an unequal power dynamic, but the overarching legal framework was one of coercion. The very existence of a large slave population provided a ready outlet for male sexual desires outside of marriage, further complicating the landscape of sexual identities and relationships. Then there's the Roman fascination with, and sometimes anxiety about, different forms of sexual expression. While male-male relationships existed, they were viewed differently than in Greece. For a Roman citizen male, being the active, penetrative partner in a sexual act with another male, particularly one of lower status like a slave or a prostitute, was generally acceptable and didn't necessarily compromise his masculine identity. However, to be the passive partner, to be penetrated, was often stigmatized for a freeborn Roman citizen, as it was seen as effeminate, a surrender of his masculine dominance. This anxiety about passivity, about maintaining one's virtus, heavily policed male sexual identity. The poet Catullus, in the 1st century BCE, wrote poems that were shockingly explicit by later standards, often insulting his enemies by accusing them of sexual passivity or excessive oral desires, demonstrating how sexual acts were linked to social honor and shame. If you were a Roman man, your public identity could be shattered by rumors of unmanly sexual behavior. The pressure to conform to a specific model of active, dominant masculinity was intense. Marriage laws themselves, like the Julian laws on marriage and adultery enacted by Emperor Augustus around 18 BCE, aim to encourage marriage, reward procreation among the elite, and penalize celibacy and adultery. These laws were a direct attempt by the state to regulate citizens' private lives for the perceived good of the empire. Your identity as a good citizen became explicitly linked to your marital status and your contribution to the next generation. If you were an unmarried man of a certain age, or a married man without children, you could face legal disadvantages. The state was literally trying to legislate your sexual and reproductive identity into a specific mold. Imagine getting a tax penalty for not having enough kids, a far cry from modern anxieties about overpopulation. And what of the quirky or less mainstream? Well, Rome had its share. The cult of Cybele, an Anatolian mother goddess, involved priests known as Galli, who famously castrated themselves in ecstatic rituals. Their sexual identity was radically redefined by this act of devotion, setting them apart, making them figures of both awe and perhaps some trepidation. They dressed in female attire and adopted feminine mannerisms, occupying a unique, liminal gender and sexual space within Roman society. This is a stark reminder that even within a seemingly rigid system, there were always individuals and groups whose identities challenged the dominant norms, often through dramatic, bodily transformations tied to religious fervor. It makes your cousin who got that slightly regrettable tattoo seem rather tame by comparison, doesn't it? The Colosseum, while known for gladiator combat, also sometimes featured mythological reenactments that could include rather explicit and often fatal for the performers, usually condemned criminals or slaves, sexual scenarios, a bizarre public spectacle that blended entertainment, punishment, and myth in a way that speaks volumes about Roman attitudes towards bodies and power. The very architecture of a Roman city, with its public baths where sex is often mixed, at least in earlier periods, its brothels, lupaneria, often decorated with explicit frescoes, and the ubiquitous phallic imagery found on everything from amulets to buildings, as symbols of good luck and protection against the evil eye, suggests a culture that was, in many ways, more overtly sexualized in its public spaces than many later societies. Section 5. You feel the monumental stone of Rome crumble, not in a day, but over centuries, the echoes of legions fading into the tramp of new peoples, the pronouncements of emperors replaced by the sermons of bishops. The air grows heavier, not with the dust of empire, but with the scent of incense and beeswax, and the pervasive weight of sin and salvation. You've arrived in medieval Europe, a vast expanse of time stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, and here, the psychological and identity aspects of sex are overwhelmingly filtered through the lens of Christian doctrine. The relatively pragmatic, if often harsh, legalism of Rome gives way to a moral framework where your sexual desires, your very body, become a battleground for your immortal soul. Your identity is no longer primarily that of a citizen of an empire, but that of a soul striving for heaven or plummeting towards hell, and your sexuality is a key player in that cosmic drama. You find yourself in a world where the teachings of church fathers like Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 AD, cast a long and influential shadow. Augustine, in his Confessions, famously wrestled with his own sexual desires, ultimately framing lust, concupiscence, as a consequence of original sin, a disordered appetite that pulls humanity away from God. While marriage and procreation were sanctioned, even seen as a remedy for concupiscence, the ideal state, increasingly, was celibacy, a spiritual striving to transcend the flesh. This had a profound impact on how sexual identity was conceived. To be holy or spiritually advanced often meant to renounce or strictly control sexual expression. The monk, the nun, the celibate priest, these figures rose in spiritual status, their identities defined by their renunciation of worldly and particularly sexual pleasures. If you felt a strong calling to a religious life, your sexual identity, was often one of deliberate suppression, a sacrifice offered for a higher spiritual reward. This wasn't just a niche lifestyle choice. It was presented as the pinnacle of spiritual achievement for many. For the laity, those not in religious orders, marriage was the only legitimate context for sexual activity, and its primary purpose, according to dominant church teaching, was procreation. Pleasure, while not always entirely condemned within marriage, was often viewed with suspicion, as something that could easily lead to sin if pursued for its own sake rather than as an incidental byproduct of the procreative act. This creates a subtle but powerful psychological shift. Your sexual identity within marriage is less about partnership or romantic love, though these certainly existed, and more about fulfilling a divine commandment to be fruitful and multiply, while simultaneously guarding against the sin of lust. Imagine trying to explain to your medieval spouse that you're just not in the mood, when the eternal fate of your soul and the continuation of the human race are apparently on the line. The pressure to perform for very different reasons than in the Roman brothel is back. The penitentials, manuals for priests that emerged from the 6th century onwards, particularly in Ireland and England, offer a fascinating, if somewhat alarming, window into the medieval moral landscape. These detailed lists of sins, including a vast array of sexual transgressions and their corresponding penances, fasting, prayers, pilgrimages, show an obsessive concern with regulating every conceivable aspect of sexual behavior. They covered everything from adultery and fornication to specific sexual acts, thoughts, and even dreams. Your inner world, your most private desires and fantasies, became subject to ecclesiastical scrutiny and potential penance. This fostered an introspective, often guilt-ridden, sexual psychology. Your identity was constantly being measured against an intricate code of permissible and forbidden acts, leading to a state of perpetual vigilance against temptation. One can only imagine the anxiety generated by wondering if that slightly too long glance at the baker's wife required 3 Hail Marys or a week of bread and water. The invention of the individual confessional booth, becoming more common from the 13th century onwards, further privatized and internalized this process of moral self-examination regarding sexual thoughts and deeds. Historians still argue whether the Church's intense focus on sexual sin was primarily about genuine spiritual concern for its flock or also a mechanism for social control, reinforcing its authority and shaping a compliant populace. Regardless of intent, the effect was to deeply ingrain a sense of sexual sinfulness into the Western psyche. Yet, amidst this pervasive atmosphere of prohibition and penance, human desire, as it always does, found ways to express itself, sometimes in surprising forms. The concept of courtly love, which emerged in the high medieval period, roughly 11th to 13th centuries, among the nobility of France and other parts of Europe, offers a striking counterpoint. Celebrated in the songs of troubadours and the romances of authors like Chrétien de Troyes, courtly love often idealized a passionate, ennobling, but typically unconsummated, love for a highborn lady, often someone else's wife. The knight's identity was shaped by his selfless devotion, his performance of heroic deeds in her name, his suffering from unrequited love. This was a highly stylized, ritualized form of eroticism, where the longing, the yearning, the emotional intensity itself became a mark of a refined and noble character. It was a way of channeling powerful desires into a socially acceptable, even admirable, framework, though one that often existed in tension with the Church's teachings on lust and marital fidelity. My love for Lady Guinevere is pure and ennobling, Sir Lancelot might argue. It just makes me want to overthrow kingdoms for her. Totally spiritual. Then there are the more fringe and sometimes heretical expressions of sexuality and religious identity. Groups like the Cathars in southern France, 12th to 13th centuries, who held dualistic beliefs about a good spiritual world and an evil material world, including the body, paradoxically sometimes practiced extreme asceticism, rejecting marriage and procreation altogether, while other interpretations suggest some factions believed that since the flesh was already evil, what one did with it didn't matter as much for the soul's salvation, a view the Church vehemently condemned. Their identity was one of radical opposition to mainstream doctrine, and their sexual ethics, however interpreted, set them apart. The existence of figures like holy anchoresses, women who chose to be enclosed in small cells attached to churches, dedicating their lives to prayer and contemplation, their identities defined by extreme piety and withdrawal from the world, including all sexual contact, further illustrates the diverse, often extreme, ways religious belief shaped sexual identity. One such famous figure was Julian of Norwich in 14th century England. And what about the common folk, those not writing poetry or theological treatises? Their lives were undoubtedly shaped by the Church's teachings, but also by folk customs, seasonal festivals, some with pre-Christian, pagan roots that had surprisingly sexual undertones, like May Day celebrations, and the sheer pragmatism of agricultural life. For them, sex, marriage, and procreation were intimately tied to survival, to the continuation of the family farm, to having enough hands to work the land. Section 6. You feel the chill and the certainty of the medieval world begin to thaw, a new light, warm and human-focused, seeping in through the cracks of dogma and decay. The air itself seems to shimmer with a rediscovered vibrancy, the scent of oil paint and wet plaster mingling with the ink of freshly printed books and the murmur of Italian courtyards. You have stepped into the Renaissance, a period of extraordinary cultural rebirth that swept across Europe, primarily from the 14th to the 16th century. While religion certainly didn't disappear, its absolute dominance over every aspect of life, including the psychological and identity aspects of sex, began to be subtly challenged by a renewed interest in classical antiquity, a burgeoning humanism, and a celebration of the human form and human potential. Your identity is no longer solely defined by your relationship to God and the Church. It's also starting to be shaped by your capacity for reason, your appreciation of beauty, and yes, even your experience of earthly pleasures. You find yourself surrounded by an explosion of art that looks and feels dramatically different from the stylized, often severe, iconography of the medieval period. Think of Michelangelo's David, completed in 1504, a colossal nude figure, not shamed by his nakedness, but celebrated for his physical perfection, his confident contrapposto. Or Botticelli's Birth of Venus, circa 1486, where the goddess of love emerges from the sea, her nudity sensual, yet imbued with a kind of classical purity. This artistic rediscovery and glorification of the human body, often directly inspired by newly unearthed Greek and Roman sculptures, had a profound psychological impact. It implicitly validated the body, and by extension, its desires, as something worthy of admiration, not just a source of temptation and sin. Your own body, your physical self, starts to feel less like a prison for the soul and more like a magnificent creation in its own right. This shift allowed for a subtle but significant expansion of sexual identity, one that could embrace physical beauty and sensuality without necessarily invoking immediate damnation. Perhaps, you might think, gazing at a Titian Venus, this whole body is evil thing was a bit overstated. Humanism, that great intellectual movement of the Renaissance, championed by figures like Petrarch and Erasmus, placed a new emphasis on human reason, individual achievement, and the study of classical literature and philosophy. Remember Plato and his ideas on Eros? These were back in vogue. While most humanists were devout Christians, they sought to reconcile faith with a more optimistic view of human nature and earthly life. This created a space for a more nuanced understanding of love and desire. Treatises on love, like Marsilio Ficino's commentary on Plato's Symposium in the late 15th century, became popular, exploring the philosophical and even spiritual dimensions of human affection and attraction, often in a way that was less condemnatory than some medieval theological tracts. Your identity could now include being a virtuous lover, someone whose passions were refined by intellect and an appreciation for beauty, both physical and spiritual. It was a sophisticated upgrade from just trying not to commit a mortal sin every time you felt a flutter of attraction. Of course, this didn't mean a complete sexual free-for-all. The Church still wielded immense power, and figures like Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery Dominican friar who effectively ruled Florence in the 1490s, famously instigated the bonfire of the vanities, where citizens were encouraged to burn sinful objects like cosmetics, mirrors, and immoral books and art. This indicates the ongoing tension between the new humanistic appreciation for worldly beauty and pleasure and the persistent medieval fear of sin and damnation. Your sexual identity was still being pulled in these two directions, towards a celebration of earthly life and love, and towards the stern call for repentance and spiritual purity. It must have been a bit like trying to enjoy a particularly decadent tiramisu while a very stern monk glares at you from across the piazza. Marriage, especially among the burgeoning merchant class and the aristocracy, remained a crucial institution, often still driven by dynastic and economic considerations. However, there are hints of a growing emphasis on companionship and even romantic love within marriage, as reflected in some of the literature and personal correspondence of the period. Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, 1528, a hugely influential guide to ideal courtly behavior, discusses the qualities of the perfect courtier and lady, including grace, wit, and the ability to engage in refined conversation and flirtation. While still operating within a framework of social decorum, it suggests an identity where charm, elegance, and a sophisticated understanding of human relationships, including their erotic undercurrents, were highly valued. Your ability to navigate these complex social and romantic dances became a key part of your identity as a civilized individual. You weren't just married. You were part of a refined partnership, ideally, though not always actually, characterized by mutual respect and affection. Historians still argue about the actual lived sexual experiences of ordinary people during the Renaissance, as much of the surviving evidence pertains to the elite. However, court records and popular literature suggest that premarital sex, while officially condemned, was not uncommon, and that popular attitudes towards sexuality could sometimes be more earthy and less repressed than the official pronouncements of the Church or the idealized portrayals of humanist philosophers. The bawdy tales of Boccaccio's Decameron, mid-14th century, with its frank and often humorous depictions of sexual desire, trickery, and adultery, were immensely popular, suggesting an audience that appreciated a more worldly and less moralistic view of human nature. Your private identity, your secret desires and transgressions, might have found a certain validation in such stories, even if your public identity had to conform to stricter codes. And what of the quirky or unconventional? The figure of the courtesan, particularly in cities like Venice and Rome, reached a new level of prominence and sophistication during the Renaissance. Women like Veronica Franco in 16th-century Venice were not only celebrated for their beauty and sexual allure, but were also accomplished poets and intellectuals, engaging with prominent artists and thinkers. Their identity was a complex blend of seductress, muse, and intellectual companion, operating with a degree of freedom and influence that was remarkable for women of that era, albeit outside the bounds of conventional marriage. It's a far cry from the often brutalized existence of a Roman slave or the constrained piety of a medieval nun. Their lives, though precarious and often morally condemned, represent a fascinating assertion of female agency and a uniquely Renaissance sexual identity. You can imagine Veronica Franco holding her own in a debate with philosophers, then composing a sonnet about it, all while looking fabulous. That's multitasking. Section 7. You feel the artistic exuberance of the Renaissance gradually giving way to a cooler, more analytical atmosphere. The rich velvets and passionate hues are being replaced by the crisp lines of scientific diagrams and the clear, sober prose of philosophical treatises. You've entered the Age of Enlightenment, that sprawling intellectual and cultural movement that swept across Europe and America primarily during the 17th and 18th centuries. Here, reason is enthroned as the highest human faculty, and its bright, often unforgiving, light is shown into every corner of human experience, including the often murky and irrational realm of sex. Your identity is now increasingly framed by your capacity for rational thought, your place in a natural order that science and philosophy are busily trying to define, and your understanding of your own desires not as divine mysteries or sinful urges, but as phenomena to be categorized, understood, and perhaps managed for the greater good of society and the individual. You find yourself amidst thinkers who are obsessed with observation, classification, and the discovery of universal laws. Just as Newton was uncovering the laws of physics, philosophers and early scientists were attempting to apply similar principles to human nature, including our sexual nature. Medical texts of the period, for instance, began to explore anatomy and physiology with a new, detached empiricism. Figures like William Harvey, who famously described the circulation of blood in the early 17th century, paved the way for a more mechanistic understanding of the body. While not directly focused on sexual identity, this shift towards seeing the body as a complex machine governed by natural laws subtly began to demystify it. Your sexual responses, your desires, start to be seen less as spiritual battles and more as biological processes, albeit ones that still needed to be governed by reason and morality. You're not just a soul trapped in flesh, you're a fascinating, if sometimes inconveniently driven, biological organism. Fascinating. Your inner Enlightenment philosopher might muse, this surge of dopamine upon viewing a comely ankle must categorize. Philosophers like John Locke, with his emphasis on experience and an individual's right to life, liberty, and property, laid groundwork that would eventually influence ideas about personal autonomy, though his direct comments on sexual matters were conventional for his time. However, the broader Enlightenment emphasis on individual rights and freedoms and the questioning of traditional authority, including religious authority, began to create cracks in the old monolithic structures that had long dictated sexual morality and identity. If individuals possessed natural rights, did that extend to some measure of control over their own bodies and affections, as long as they didn't harm others? The question hung in the air, even if the answers were slow and hesitant in coming. Your identity starts to include the notion of being an individual with certain inherent entitlements, a subtle but profound shift from being primarily defined by your place in a divinely ordained hierarchy. Then you have figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings in the mid-18th century had an immense impact, though often in contradictory ways. On one hand, he championed natural feeling and authenticity, a departure from artificial social conventions. His novel Julie, or The New Heloise, was a sensational bestseller, exploring passionate love and romantic sensibility. This contributed to a growing culture of sentimentality, where romantic love and emotional compatibility began to be seen as increasingly important for personal happiness, and thus for identity, even within marriage. Your identity could be that of a person of feeling, someone whose capacity for deep emotional connection, including romantic and implicitly erotic connection, was a mark of a refined soul. On the other hand, Rousseau also had some rather traditional, even regressive, views on gender roles, believing women were naturally suited for domesticity and subordination to men. So, while male identity might be expanding to include romantic sensibility, female identity, in Rousseau's influential view, was still largely circumscribed by her role as wife and mother, her sexuality primarily in service to those roles. Feel deeply, ladies, Rousseau seems to say, but do it quietly, and mostly about your children and how tidy the house is. The Enlightenment also saw the rise of what we might call early sexology, though the term itself wouldn't be coined until much later. Thinkers and medical men began to categorize different forms of sexual behavior and desire, often with a moralizing and pathologizing lens. Masturbation, for example, became a subject of intense medical anxiety in the 18th century, with figures like Samuel Auguste Tizot publishing influential treatises warning of its supposedly dire physical and mental consequences, from consumption to insanity. This anti-onanism crusade created a new layer of sexual anxiety and a new, negative identity, the masturbator, a figure seen as weak-willed, degenerate, and physically compromised. Your most private acts, even those harming no one, became medicalized and moralized, shaping your secret identity and fostering immense guilt. Imagine the stress of thinking that your perfectly natural explorations could lead to you spontaneously combusting or developing a sudden interest in collecting porcelain dolls. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment's focus on reason and nature ultimately led to greater sexual liberation or, in some ways, to new forms of regulation and control. While it challenged some religious dogmas, it also sought to define and enforce new, natural norms, often based on procreative heterosexual monogamy, casting other expressions of sexuality as unnatural or perverse. This laid some of the groundwork for later medical and psychiatric classifications of sexual identities. The natural order, as defined by Enlightenment science and philosophy, often looked suspiciously like the prevailing social order, just with a new, rational-sounding justification. And the quirky or fringe. Consider the infamous Hellfire Clubs of 18th-century Britain and Ireland, secret societies of upper-class men, and sometimes women, rumored to engage in pagan rituals, heavy drinking, and sexual debauchery, often as a deliberate affront to conventional morality and religion. Figures like Sir Francis Dashwood and John Wilkes were associated with these scandalous gatherings. While the extent of their satanic activities was likely exaggerated for sensational effect, these clubs represent a deliberate, albeit privileged and often hypocritical, rebellion against the perceived stuffiness and moral strictures of the age. Their members cultivated an identity as daring libertines, flouting convention and indulging their appetites in a theatrical display of enlightened hedonism, or perhaps just good old-fashioned naughtiness. It was like a very exclusive, very badly behaved book club, where the books were probably just props. You also see the emergence of more explicit, though often clandestine, erotic literature and art. Works like John Cleland's Fanny Hill, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, published in 1748, while frequently banned, were widely read, offering detailed and often highly romanticized accounts of a prostitute's adventures.